bro shit. It's time for some gay bro shit. Get into it, gay bro shit. Let's fuck with it, gay bro shit.
Hey, hi, hello, bros and hoes and theys and thems. This is Gay Bro Shit, a podcast about gay fitness culture, body image, and gender. And you can call me Brodecia because I, too, probably never really existed, but also because I think that I would love to lead an army of local folks against the Roman Empire because fuck those colonizers. Anyways, today, it's a bit of a heavy topic. We're going to be discussing eating disorders and disordered eating. And so before we get into it, we need to have a bit of, well, not a bit of, a pretty big content warning. So if you are dealing with an eating disorder, or if you've ever dealt with an eating disorder, this may be a really difficult and triggering conversation for you. So definitely proceed with caution and care. And I'm not offended if you stop right here. And I also need to state that I am not a therapist or a medical provider or eating disorder clinician. I don't have any professional experience in this matter. I'm just a former fitness trainer, gym bro, and nerd who likes to do research. Although this topic was definitely not fun to research. So I will be talking about both eating disorders and disordered eating, and these are actually two different but related concepts, and I will get into the differences, but know that I may use these terms interchangeably, and sometimes I use one term to refer to both for the sake of not having to say both terms every single time. And I'm going to start off with by talking about how prevalent these issues are in the LGBTQ plus community, because I really want to get across how many of us are struggling with these issues, and in ways that you may not even realize, because sometimes these behaviors take a form you don't expect them to. And because when we are truly honest, very few of us have a completely healthy relationship with food, because so often what society labels as healthy is not healthy at all. And we also need to know that the person we think of when we think of somebody with an eating disorder, which is usually a thin, young, white woman, is only a very small portion of the people who actually struggle with them. All right, well, let's wade into the darkness, because as they say, the only way out is through. So pretty much all existing research on the topic has found that queer people are much more likely to experience disordered eating and eating disorders. And I'm going to read a big chunk of text from a 2020 meta-review by Parker and Harriger. Here we go. LGBT adults and adolescents experience greater incidence of eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors than their heterosexual and cisgendered counterparts. Additionally, gay, bisexual, and transgender adults and adolescents were all at an increased risk for eating disorders and disordered eating behaviors. Mixed results were found for lesbian adults and adolescents. Further research has indicated that approximately 54% of LGBT adolescents have been diagnosed with a full syndrome eating disorder during their lifetime, with an additional 21% suspecting that they had an eating disorder at some point during their life. Additionally, 60.9% of LGBT adolescents in one study reported in engaging in at least one disordered eating behavior within the past year. Transgender youth were more likely to report eating disorder behaviors compared to cisgendered populations. Other studies indicated that LGBT youth engaged in disordered eating behaviors such as purging, fasting, dieting with intention of weight loss, and taking diet pills at a higher rate compared to heterosexual youth, putting them at greater risks for developing an eating disorder. Further, the results of one study indicate that over half of sexual and gender minority youth experience weight-based victimization from family members and peers, which in turn was associated with increased rates of binge eating, dieting, and other unhealthy weight control behaviors, in addition to stress, exercise avoidance, less physical activity, and poorer sleep. Finally, a recent study examining participants upon admission to eating disorder treatment reported that sexual and gender minority participants had more acute eating disorder symptoms and higher rates of abuse compared to cisgendered heterosexual participants. All right, that was a lot, but I'm going to keep going. They found that with regards to adults, adult sexual minorities have been found to have experienced significant disordered eating symptomology, including desire to be thin, binging, purging, and body dissatisfaction, which correlated with being overly concerned about body shape and size and level of femininity. These behaviors occurred at higher rates than within the heterosexual and cisgendered male population, but they did not appear to be significantly different from heterosexual and cisgendered females. Adult sexual minorities were also almost twice as likely to experience food addiction, defined as the application of the criteria of substance use disorder to highly rewarding foods, sorry, just skimming through that, compared to heterosexuals, which was aggravated by heterosexist harassment, and sexual minorities have reported higher rates of weight discrimination than heterosexual peers, even after controlling for body mass index and race. Also, according to a 2019 study by Calzo, Austin, and McCallie in the UK, they found, and this is a direct quote of their conclusions, at age 14, gay and bisexual boys and mostly heterosexual girls reported greater body dissatisfaction than their same gender heterosexual peers. All sexual minority boys and mostly heterosexual girls reported greater mean dysfunctional eating behaviors than their same gender heterosexual peers. At age 16, gay and bisexual boys had 12.5 times the odds of heterosexual boys of binge eating. Mostly heterosexual boys had over 3 times the odds of reporting binge eating, and sexual minority girls had over twice the odds of heterosexual girls of purging and binge eating. Then there was a 2019 study by Bell, Rieger, and Hirsch looking at queer adults, and there's a chart of their findings, so I'm going to just attempt to read through it here. In their study, which I can't remember what the sample size was, but it wasn't massive, but they did a survey of a bunch of queer individuals. And in their study, 47.6% of gay men respondents, 66.7% of lesbian women respondents, and 62.6% of TGNC, which means trans and gender nonconforming adults, I'm going to use the acronym again, qualified as being prone to an eating disorder. And they define what that means, but I'm not going to quite get into that. We also found that 23.3% of gay men, 31.9% of lesbians, and 22.6% of TGNC adults reported eating in secret. They also found that 63.1% of gay men, 81.9% of lesbians, and 67.2% of TGNC adults reported that their weight affected the way they felt about themselves. They also found that 14% of gay men, 34.7% of lesbians, and 30.2% of TGNC adults were either currently dealing with an eating disorder or have had one in the past. Notice that trans people, gender nonconforming people were twice as likely as gay men. And finally, I found that 47.4% of gay men, 62.5% of lesbians, and 69.8% of trans and gender nonconforming individuals were currently dissatisfied with their eating habits. Then there was another study of almost 300,000 college students that found that more than 15% of the trans people surveyed reported a diagnosis of an eating disorder, compared with only 0.55% of cisgendered heterosexual men and 1.85% of cisgendered heterosexual women. So basically seven plus times as the rate for transgendered people over cisgendered women. So the numbers definitely vary by who you ask. And I just listed off a lot of numbers really quickly. And frankly, my head was spinning a little bit reading them. But it is obvious that this is a problem that disproportionately affects queer people. And a lot of the other things I'm pulling from today are in an article by Healthline that I'll post the URL to in the episode description. So according to this article, here's some just other general facts about eating disorders and disordered eating. People at higher body weights seem to be much more likely to engage in disordered eating habits, including those that could meet eating disorder criteria. However, because they have higher BMIs, they're often excluded from receiving diagnoses and therefore treatment, and that just 6% of people with eating disorders are considered medically underweight. That means they have a BMI of under 18.5. This article also says that men account for 25% of anorexia and bulimia diagnoses, and that at least 1 in 7 men will experience an eating disorder by age 40. They also found that disordered eating is increasing among people ages 45 and older more quickly than among younger adults. Yeah, big yikes, everybody. And this is just a sampling of some of the numbers I could find. And I am sorry for just throwing a ton of numbers at you. I think it really does feel like bombardment, but I really just want to emphasize how widespread this is. It's a problem that affects a huge proportion of it, potentially as much as 60% of us. Now let's talk about the problem itself. What exactly is disordered eating? According to that same Healthline article, these are the signs and symptoms. First sign is avoiding entire food groups, certain macronutrients, or foods with specific textures or colors without a medical reason. Binge eating. Engaging in compensatory behaviors, I said that wrong, but I don't care, such as exercising to make up for food you've consumed, exercising compulsively, cutting food into small pieces, slowing down the pace of eating, or otherwise attempting to trick yourself into feeling fuller from less food, fasting to lose weight, feeling guilt, disgust, or anxiety before or after eating, following strict food rules or rituals, intentionally skipping meals or restricting food intake, including skipping meals before or after you've consumed a large meal, food you consider unhealthy, or alcohol. Opting to eat only foods you consider quote-unquote clean or healthy, participating in fad diets to lose weight, engaging in purging behaviors such as using laxatives or making yourself vomit to control your weight, weighing yourself or tracking body measurements often, and tracking food source or calories to the point of preoccupation. And on that last note, in one study of people with eating disorders, 75% of them reported using the app MyFitnessPal to track calories, with 73% saying that it contributed to their disorder. So disordered eating describes a range of unhealthy behaviors towards food. And on the spectrum between healthy eating and eating disorders, we should think of disordered eating as in between the two. Maybe a step on the way, or maybe just the destination. But this list, if you were keeping track, you probably were able to identify at least a handful of things that you've done personally. I counted 10 out of the 14 symptoms that I've personally done in the past. And I'm currently weighing myself every day and tracking all my food using an app. So does this mean I have a problem with food? Yeah, maybe. But by this metric, almost everyone does. And the reason we need to be aware of this is because it's a proverbial slippery slope from disordered eating to an actual disorder. So we might ask then, when does it rise to the level of actually being a full-blown disorder? And in the simplest terms, disordered behavior becomes a disorder when the behaviors overtake your life and become your primary focus, meaning you're putting everything else aside in order to focus on, your food or lack thereof. But people can also be very good at denying and hiding their situation or minimalizing it because they think that their behaviors are common. Unlike disordered eating, which is a range of behaviors, eating disorders are specific diagnosable diseases with a set of criteria that must be met in order for a diagnosis to be made. And there's a few esoteric disorders we won't cover today, but I'm going to go over the main eating disorders and attempt to explain them in the simplest possible way. All right, so the first one we're going to mention is anorexia, and I think this is by far the most well-known eating disorder, and that's essentially attempting to lose weight by starving yourself, avoiding food as much as possible. And for simplicity, I'm going to define starvation as eating 30% fewer calories per day than what you need. So in general, that's anything less than 1,200 calories for the average woman, cis woman specifically, and 1,800 calories for the average cis man. Now, caloric needs certainly vary. For me, that number is probably closer to, 2,200 at this point. The fact that I know this and I'm keeping track is disordered eating, but I'm admitting that. We also have binge eating disorder, and that's repeated episodes of rapidly consuming an excessive quantity of food. As I mentioned before, that is significantly more common in queer people than it is in cis or straight people. We also have bulimia, which is periods of binge eating behavior followed by purging. Purging can take the form of vomiting, laxatives, exercise, or fasting. That's probably the other most sort of well-known eating disorder. There's also purging disorder, and that's for people who eat normally but still purge. So there's binge eating disorder, there's purging disorder, and then there's bulimia, which is a combination of the two. There's another disorder called ARFID, which stands for avoidant and restrictive feeding disorder. That's where people avoid specific foods due to sensory characteristics such as texture, smell, appearance, taste. And these people aren't trying to lose weight. They're just mistrustful of food or uninterested in it. And they might also have traumatic experiences with food, such as choking or severe digestive issues. And in extreme cases, people eat as few as only 5 different food items. And this is definitely more common in children and also with people on the autism spectrum. But it can also be a symptom of a mental health issue. So I know for me, when I'm really struggling with my mental health, I have zero interest in food because sometimes for weeks at a time. And so this is definitely something that I've experienced for sure. It was never something I was diagnosed with because it's only ever been a symptom of a more immediate mental health issue. Another eating disorder of note is pica, and that is eating or craving food. Sorry, it's actually eating or craving things that are not food. And I'll let your imaginations run wild with that and also with what you define as food and not food. But if you remember My Strange Addiction, any number of people on that show were eating some weird shit. And then finally, we have 2 more disorders we're going to focus on specifically today, one of which is atypical anorexia. And this describes people who qualify as anorexic, but whose body weight is not underweight according to their BMI. So the cutoff for this is usually 18.5. And then finally, we have orthorexia. And this is not actually a current official disorder in the DSM, but it is a proposed disorder. It's an obsession with clean eating that goes to a pathological place. All right, so let's start with orthorexia because I think more than the other disorders mentioned here, it feels like the logical extreme conclusion of wellness and fitness culture. And it obviously makes me really uncomfortable because I'm somebody who has worked in fitness for over a decade and also has put out episodes of this very show that talk about some of the ways that you can attempt to change your body with your food. So I'm not ignoring that and sort of embracing the fact that this is wildly uncomfortable for me. So here's what orthorexia looks like. Here's a list of symptoms. Compulsive checking of ingredient lists and nutrition labels. An increase in concern about the health of ingredients. Cutting out an increasing number of food groups, such as all sugar, all carbs, all dairy, all meat, all animal products. Side note, I don't think being vegan or vegetarian is orthorexia. That's a totally different conversation. All right, we'd also want to look for an inability to eat anything but a narrow group of foods that are deemed quote unquote healthy or pure. Unusual interest in the health of what others are eating. A feeling of superiority around one's nutrition and intolerance of other people's food behaviors and beliefs. High levels of perfectionism. Spending hours per day thinking about what food might be served at upcoming events. Showing high levels of distress when safe or healthy foods aren't available. Obsessive following of food and healthy lifestyle blogs on social media, or I guess social media accounts in general. And finally, body image concerns may or may not be present. So according to the proposed criteria developed by researchers Dunn and Bratman, the compulsive behavior and mental preoccupation becomes clinically impairing when any of the following are met. First thing is malnutrition, severe weight loss, or other medical complications from restricted diet. Second thing is interpersonal distress or impairment of social, academic, or vocational functioning, secondary to beliefs or behaviors about healthy diet. And the last one is positive body image, self-worth, identity, and or satisfaction excessively dependent on compliance with self-defined quote-unquote healthy eating behavior. All right, so here's the thing about this particular disorder that I find fascinating and terrifying. The behaviors outlined as a disorder are extremely common in the fitness community and in the wellness community and industry for both. And if you get on the internet or watch TV, listen to a podcast such as My Hypocritical Ass, you are bombarded with information about what foods are supposedly good and which ones are supposedly bad. And so much of the reasoning sounds plausible or compelling, but also often completely contradictory. So let's just give an example here. First, we hear someone talking about how gluten causes inflammation, so we cut out gluten, even if we aren't gluten intolerant. We start buying gluten-free products at the grocery store. But then we hear that packaged gluten-free foods aren't good because they contain a lot of extreme chemicals that make them more palatable, and so we stop eating these too. But then we hear that all grain is bad because it spikes your insulin too much, and insulin is really the thing that's making you fat. So you cut out rice and oats and corn and quinoa, and now we're only getting our carbs from fruit, vegetables, nuts, and legumes. But then one of these paleo people says that actually beans are bad because we only started eating them in the last few thousand years, and our bodies don't know how to digest them fully, and they also contain lectins, which can cause inflammation in your gut. Then we hear we can't eat fruit because our body can't tell the difference between the sugar in fruit and the sugar in processed foods. And we know sugar's bad because, everybody knows that. So now we can still eat vegetables and meat and fish, but oh wait, fish contains mercury, which is highly toxic. So if we're eating more fish because we can't eat these other things, now we're getting more mercury. So maybe we won't eat any large fish or stick to shellfish and freshwater fish. But then again, shellfish are bottom feeders that ingest any number of potential bad things and filter it out. So how can we trust that we're not eating bad things when we eat shellfish? Can't eat red meat because it increases your risk of certain cancers. Can't eat eggs because they have too much cholesterol. Can't eat dairy because that's food for the animals' babies and not meant to be eaten by humans. Everybody knows that. Can't eat nuts because it takes 3 gallons of water just to grow one almond. And you keep applying different moral and health metrics until eventually all you can have is water. Somewhere along the line, you have to decide to stop. that whatever you're eating is good enough, healthy enough, clean enough, because if you don't draw a line, you're left with nothing. And I'm struck by how easy it is to just believe something that somebody says because you trust and respect them and never really question where they got it from. And suddenly that information just becomes the truth and you just carry it on with you forever. And this is what makes parasocial relationships so potentially dangerous and why it's so easy to fall for charlatans. Sometimes Dr. Oz has legitimate medical information, and sometimes he's just trying to sell you supplements that he makes money off of. Sometimes Joe Rogan has smart people on, and sometimes he asks really good questions. But then he also lets wild-ass conspiracy theorists come on and talk and just say utter complete bullshit that's actually generally harmful. Broken clocks can be right twice a day. But I also have this internal tension as someone who likes to eat in a very specific, intentional way, and who also has fitness goals and has aesthetic goals. And I'm lucky that I have the constitution of a goat and I can pretty much digest anything without problem. So I can basically eat most anything. But then I start applying some kind of judgment to it, either moral or based on its perceived benefit, that sometimes it's hard to enjoy eating. And I kind of eat the same things over and over again because it's just much easier to buy for and prepare and then to track those macros. And I'm not super obsessive. I have room for play in there. Usually, at least one meal a day is more spontaneous. But I'm still probably going to be thinking about, does this meal have enough grams of protein? Does this meal have enough carbs? Is there fiber? Is there some healthy fat? Is there a cup or more of vegetables? And I've been doing this for long enough that it doesn't feel particularly difficult or onerous. I don't really stress out about food, but when I'm traveling or working a lot, it can be really stressful to figure out what and how to eat. And while I genuinely feel better when I'm eating with a purpose, eating with the view of fueling myself, I do envy anyone who can just eat purely intuitively with no emotional feelings about what they eat other than pleasure and contentment. And that sounds so freeing. Like when I see a group of bears just fucking eating whatever, both the animals and the humans, like, fuck, bears eating salmon at the falls. Do you ever watch that live stream of the bears hunting for fish in the falls in Alaska? Oh, it's so fucking relaxing. But food has become so political, so loaded with judgment. We use the way we eat to send a signal about our values, our status, our image, because we have built up a society where being healthy and thin is morally good and being unhealthy and fat is morally bad. And much of this fear of fatness is rooted in racism, specifically the othering of black and brown bodies, which are often bigger than white bodies. And our continued promotion of thinness is a way of reinforcing white supremacy. On that note, let's talk about atypical anorexia. As I said before, this is when somebody starves themselves, but because their BMI is over 18.5, they look either normal weight or fat, and they don't look like they have an eating disorder. Now, fat is a term that is based entirely on comparison to others, and someone is only fat because other people in proximity to them are thinner. Similarly, the BMI was originally based on comparison to others in a group rather than judging an individual against a set of standards. The original definition of obesity was that just the top 5% of fattest individuals in any given population. So the cutoff would be totally different depending on the population of people that you're looking at. There's a researcher named Aaron Harrop whose work specializes in looking at atypical anorexia. So a lot of this information is going to be coming from them. And according to them, we are unsure of how many people have atypical anorexia, but it's probably the most common eating disorder. With our best estimate is that 2 to 2.8% of people have the disorder. But there was one small study, and in that particular study, they found that it was as much as 13%. And more people with higher BMI suffer from eating disorders than those in the underweight category. But because most studies on an eating disorder have a BMI cutoff of 18.5, most of these people are missed. So we just don't have studies looking at this population. Aaron also says that the average time people live with symptoms before seeking treatment is 11.6 years. That's right. Over a decade of suffering before people are finally driven to seek treatment. And this sounds like it is a fucking crazy amount of time, but it sounds like one. And it's because bodies differ in their adaptation to food restrictions. Some people get sick and emaciated very quickly, and other people can survive for long periods on little food, especially for fat people who may be rewarded by others for their weight loss, even if these people losing weight are actually starving. And then when people do seek treatment, clinicians often don't understand fat people seeking treatment and question if they really need treatment, or they try and treat them for other disorders entirely based on assumptions. So it's very common for people with atypical anorexia to be treated for binge eating disorder instead, because the people giving them care are assuming that they must be eating in excess and that's what's making them fat, even though the truth is that they're starving themselves. And Aaron gives their own personal experience of being an atypical anorexia and seeking treatment only to be put on a calorie restricted diet for weight loss when they needed to be on a refeeding diet because they were literally there because they were not fucking eating. Because people have got it into their heads that the number one health issue affecting fat people is the fact that they're fat. And our healthcare system and providers are constantly looking to get fat people smaller before treating them for any other condition, ignoring the fact that fatness may actually be the result of any number of other issues that need to be addressed first. And while being fat may or may not make you unhealthy, or may not lead you to dying a little bit younger than you would have, starving yourself is going to make someone die much, much faster, potentially in a matter of weeks if you eat nothing at all. Eating disorders are much more immediately dangerous than fatness. If you stop eating, you will die very quickly. If you become fat, you will not. And in study after study, when people were surveyed on their attitudes about fat people, participants believed that people with obesity were less evolved and less human than people without obesity. So clearly this is a big, big problem. And yet, we don't hear much about these issues. And when we do, it's always in the form of a dangerously thin person. Why is nobody doing anything? That's because in 2023, the U.S. weight loss industry, just the U.S. weight loss industry, was worth $159 billion. That is more than the entire economic output of 153 countries. Novo Nordisk, which is the maker of the latest supposed miracle drug Ozempic, has seen its value quadruple over the last few years to $400 billion. There's so much money to be made by telling people that they're fat and selling them a solution to make them less fat. From seemingly innocuous things like diet books, diet foods, supplements, mobile apps for tracking calories or workouts, workout plans, to extreme measures like surgery, medication, supervised fasting, residential clinics, fat camps. There are a lot of people making a lot of money on our fear of fatness. So this is the landscape that we're dealing with. Queer people, especially young people, and trans people, most of all, are at risk of eating disorders. More fat people have eating disorders than thin ones, and our economy and culture are built around reinforcing disordered eating. And of course, I don't have the solutions because this is a problem well beyond anything that anyone could solve. But I do think that we can start by working on ourselves because that's one thing we can control. We can recognize when we're eating in a disordered manner and work to mindfully reverse those behaviors. We can seek treatment if it's something we can't control. We can also think critically about what is informing our desire for thinness. We can stop judging other people's health based on their size. And if you're still doing that, you're a fucking asshole. We can stop rewarding people like celebrities and influencers, models who reinforce thin supremacy with our attention and with our money. We can set and enforce boundaries with how we allow other people to talk about our or other people's bodies. And we can stop applying values to neutral things like food. All food is just food. It is neither good nor bad, healthy nor unhealthy, nutritious nor trash. It is a necessity for survival and nothing more, nothing less, except maybe a source of pleasure and some fond memories now and then. So I'm going to leave you with that. I hope that that wasn't just a barrage of information, but I know that it probably was. And I know that it probably wasn't very comfortable. I'm certainly very uncomfortable with the topic myself. But we're going to end it there. I'm just going to advise you to be kind to yourselves and to be kind to others. Bye, bros.